Hi, friends. Adam Kirtley here, chaplain at Whitman College. I hope this message finds you well. This week, I want to talk a little bit about that tension between acknowledging these days as difficult and challenging days, and yet also having a posture toward the world in which we might be able to find and name moments for which we are grateful. I've decided to tell a story, and it's one that I've actually written and delivered as a baccalaureate address a few years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago at Whitman. Typically, I've been doing these reflections extemporaneously, but I decided to read this week's story. Really amazing little sort of piece to the story is that the hero of the story, in some ways, is a guy named Rob. Rob was a person that I first met as a fly fishing guide in Montana. It turns out that same Rob is now my neighbor. Um, Rob Schlegel, his wife Keisha, are both teaching at Whitman regularly. And so I've now come to know Rob as a neighbor and a friend, as a colleague, and not just a fly fishing guide, as he was when I first initially met him. But it is an amazingly small world. So here's my story. Several years ago, a group of my closest friends from my alma mater were in the process of planning our next reunion and every other year commitment with this group. One of my buddies emailed a lot of us to let us know that his brother in law, Rob, was a fly fishing guide in Montana and that he'd expressed a willingness to guide us on a week's long trip. Perfect, we thought. How pristine, how idyllic, how amazing it will be for us to spend this vacation in reunion in the Montana wilderness. The problem was, and this may not be a shock to any of you who know me, but neither I nor any of my pals are what you would describe as rugged outdoorsmen. In fact, other than a few movie references from my childhood, I really didn't know much about fly fishing at all, let alone have any knowledge of the specific skill set involved in casting a fly rod. We arrived in Missoula, and poor Rob must have been crestfallen when he looked upon this band of merry Midwest misfits who awkwardly fussed with the hundreds of tiny pockets on their shiny new fishing vests. But Rob was incredibly patient and gave us excellent instruction. Within a day or two, we were all able to cast with a modicum of success. Luckily for us, it was late summer and the fish were hungry, and each of us experienced the thrill of landing some fish during the first few days. We were catching mostly rainbow and cutthroat trout, all about a foot long. We had released every fish, but on the last day we agreed as a group that we would keep our catch and share in a fresh caught feast that evening. Rob gathered us around the morning coffee pot at the campsite. "All right, guys," he said. "Today we're going to a section of river that is a little more heavily wooded than where we've been the last few days. You'll spread out along the bank, and I'll move around between you to help tie flies and untangle you from trees." We all chuckled, except Rob. He really wasn't kidding. That is pretty much what he did. But before we head out, he said, "We have two things that we have to discuss. First, the moose." Rob's face grew serious. "You do not want to startle a moose along the bank," he said. "You must warn them that you're coming." We were confused. "How do you do that?" "I suggest that as you walk along the bank, you simply say the word moose over and over again so you don't surprise them." He paused for dramatic emphasis. "Moose kill people." We all immediately started practicing our moose warning. Moose, moose, moose. "Is that right? Should I do it louder?" "The next thing we need to discuss today," continued Rob, "is how to handle your fish once you land it. It's important that you kill humanely and respectfully." Rob went on to describe a process that had me squirming, and I apologize to you now for potentially making some of you uneasy, but the story requires it. He suggested that we simply put our thumb into the mouth of the fish and bend its head back, severing its spinal cord, taking its life in an instant. I took a deep breath, and for the first time that week, hoped that maybe the fish wouldn't be biting. So we trekked to the river and spread out along the bank, and I carried my rod on my shoulder and began reciting my mantra, moose, 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 moose. To this day, I don't know if Rob was just messing with us, but I encountered no moose. What I did encounter was arguably the most pristine honey hole fishing spot ever seen by any angler. Only fishing for a week, I had learned that this spot had all the markings of a primo fish habitat. A tree had fallen in the river right at a bend, which created a relatively still pool that sat adjacent to much more active current. A fish could hang out there, not working too hard, and when it felt like a snack, it could help itself to one of the insects that were landing on the still water with abundance. I stood on the other side of the river, knowing that my job was to land my fly in the middle of that still water in a way that mimicked an actual insect. I checked behind me. No trees, no moose. I pulled out some line and began to false cast, letting just the right amount of fishing line out. And when I had enough, my arm was possessed by the spirit of Brad Pitt from the film A River Runs Through It, and I created the perfect J shape above my head with 40 feet of line. I whipped my arm forward, and the fly landed perfectly in the middle of that still water, and as it did, the largest, most beautiful trout of the week leapt from the water with the kind of flair that my perfect cast deserved, and my heart was pounding from my chest as I started to reel it in. And as I did so, it began to settle on me what the next step of this process was to be. Finally, I held the fish in my hands, and I had an epiphany. The stunning beauty and perfection of this creature was entirely not for my benefit. I know that seems obtuse and it's hard to explain, but I think that until that moment, I had sort of convinced myself that the natural world is beautiful and that it in some way was for me or for humanity, and that on our best days, we took time to stand in appreciation of this thing of ours. But this fish, with its mottled greens and pinks and yellows, was pulled from a world that was not mine, and I was aware that neither was its beauty. I was in awe, and in that moment, I loved that fish. I was abundantly aware of its life and increasingly aware of the fact that I was preparing to take it. So again, I apologize here, but the story requires some level of detail about what happened next. I put my thumb into its mouth and closed my eyes and bent the head backwards. And I opened my eyes, and to my horror, the fish remained very much alive. In fact, it was decidedly more active than it had been the moment prior to my chiropractic maneuver. It looked into my eyes, and I swear I heard it say, "What the hell did you do that for?" Precisely what happened next is admittedly a little fuzzy in my memory. I remember closing my eyes and attempting to kill the fish once more. I do not, however, remember screaming like a small child while doing so. However, apparently that's what I did. And when I opened my eyes, the fish still alive, Rob was standing directly in front of me. "I thought you had encountered a moose," he said, with the slightest twinge of disappointment in his voice. He looked at me and the fish, and I held it out to him. "I can't," I said. Rob looked directly into my eyes. He said calmly yet sternly, "You can and you will, and you need to do it now." And I did. My very next attempt, I took the life of that fish and held its beautiful body in my hands, fighting back tears. Later that evening, I cleaned that fish and cooked that fish and shared that fish with a group of my dearest friends in the world in one of the most beautiful places I'd ever seen. It was, in all sincerity, the most important meal of my life. That week I learned how to catch and kill a fish, but of course, the more important and lasting lessons had to do with awe and gratitude. I loved that fish. How do we cultivate awe and gratitude in our lives, especially right now? That's the question. Some will turn to wisdom literature and sacred texts. The psalmist will say, "Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, thou art very great. Thou art clothed with honor and majesty." The Buddhist proverb says, "Enough is a feast." The opening verse of the Quran is translated to "All praise due to Allah." The Apostle Paul reminds the Thessalonians, "In all things give thanks." But of course, appealing to religion has lost resonance for many in your generation. Indeed, education and wealth are strong predictors of a-religiosity. And at a prestigious liberal arts college, we are in the business of knowledge acquisition. We must, however, create room in our lives to engage those experiences that are beyond words and answers. The collective wisdom and knowledge of our community at Whitman is impressive. But every once in a while, you'll hold a fish in your hands and you'll see beauty and life-giving powers. And what's called for in that moment is a prayer or a meditation or just a beat to pause and consider yourself and your relationship to that fish and this big blue orb you share with it. I'll end with the words of a different prophet, Carl Sagan. "For small creatures such as we, the vastness is bearable only through love." All right, friends, I hope that you find moments this week in places you might not expect to hold a fish and to find the ability to see that for which you are grateful in the midst of what is decidedly and unquestionably a challenging and complicated time. Until then, I hope you take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll look forward to seeing you around soon.